Good morning. So today's talk is called Becoming Agile. It is a variant perhaps on the keynote talk that's going to turn up at the last day of EuroSTAR. The subtitle to this is Reshaping Testing for an Agile Team. There are a lot of testers out there who are good at testing and are finding themselves challenged by Agile environments. I've been one of those testers, and I'm hoping I'll be able to share some of those perspectives on this today. So, I'm James Lyndsay. I'm a test strategist, and by a strategist I mean that I help people when they work out what they're going to plan and how they're going to plan it when it comes to testing. Agile brings a whole new set of challenges to testing and to test strategy. If you believe the scurrilous rumours, Agile was a term chosen in preference to lightweight, probably because nobody wants to be a lightweight expert. A group of guys got together in a ski lodge and they came up with the Agile Manifesto. My suggestion is that if you've not read the Agile Manifesto and you've taken the trouble to be in this webinar, that at some point during today you whack the term Agile Manifesto into Google and read it. It's brief. It's very clear. Agile has got lots of different practices. Lots of different practices come under the banner of Agile. None of them necessarily are new, but in combination they aim to enable software to be developed with momentum and flow, and to support the needs of the developer as well as the needs of the customer, and to get to valuable software as quickly as possible. Partly that's by not making more software than is needed. In my experience, I find that agility is a vibrant approach and a popular approach. I find it in lots of different locations, lots of different markets. And right now, as far as I can tell, it seems to be helping teams in plenty of different technologies, in plenty of different businesses, in plenty of different markets. To back up that opinion with some figures, we can turn to a survey done by Scott Ambler in February of this year. He used something called Dr. Dobbs' Journal, which I think is now Dr. Dobbs' Portal, and he presented his results at Agile 2008. If you go to the InfoQ website, you can actually see his presentation online videoed. You may find some of these figures interesting. I certainly did. He found that just under 70% of Dr. Dobbs' responders were using Agile approaches. Now, Dr. Dobbs is not an Agile-only journal. Indeed, I think it still has a regular column on COBOL programming. So 70% of his respondents were using Agile approaches. 56% of the respondents were beyond the pilot and using it regularly. Now, there are plenty of questions that remain around using Agile practices with large teams or dispersed teams, using Agile approaches with legacy systems, but Agile's gone a long way beyond being the latest buzzword. I find that it's an important force for change in the world of software development. And because it's an important force for change in the world of software development, it's important for us as testers. We're part of that development process. And changes to the way that software is made have impacts on us. Agility is special, if you like, in terms of its impact on testing because of two reasons, which I think I'll cover in the rest of the presentation. But to summarize, Agile projects favour adaptability over predictability. As testers, we're built to predict the future. That's what we're trying to do. And so that change that's fundamental within Agile of trying to adapt to things can come into conflict and cause tension with testing. Perhaps a more technical and practical difference is that on Agile teams, testing is central to coding. It's central to coding. And that's very different from other approaches that may have changed the way that software is developed and not had such an impact on testing. So as testers, we should be interested in agility, and we should be fascinated in it. There are also questions, though, about whether we should believe it. I'm not convinced we should believe it without question. We're skeptics, that's what we do, we're testers. But again, if we look back at Ambler's survey, we can see some of the reasons perhaps why people like to employ agility on their projects. And rather than look at why developers and designers, why coders and designers want to use agility, it's interesting to look at what the customers were felt to feel. So what the overall project qualities were. Again, in Ambler's survey, 4 in 5 respondents who were doing Agile said that they had happier customers. 4 out of 5 said they had happier customers. Similar proportions said that their teams were more productive. Over 3/4 reported they had better quality on their projects. So with information like that coming out of surveys, we as testers can't ignore these trends. And we can't ignore them because our colleagues in software and design and coding, they're not ignoring these trends. The people who commission the projects we work on, they're not ignoring these trends. So within that idea of agility favouring adaptability over predictability and the centrality of testing to coding and Agile projects, I want to ask the questions, do we have to adapt to Agile, and how can we adapt? With that in mind then, I want to talk briefly about adaptation and evolution. Can we switch over to the first slide, please, Sue? Second slide, I beg your pardon. It's the one with evolution at the top. You'll gather from this, audience, that I can't see my slides. When we talk about adapting for Agile, there are 3 different things, 3 different entities that need to adapt. Individually, we all need to adapt. Testers, if you're a tester coming onto an Agile project, you'll need to adapt. Well, testers are perhaps inherently conservative. Certainly I've found that when I've been talking about my changes that I've made to my approaches on Agile teams, I find that it sometimes engenders quite emotional reactors in testers. Sometimes those are positive emotions, sometimes negative, but it certainly generates an emotional reaction. I think it's important to recognise that as a tester looking at change, you can choose validly not to change anything you do. That will probably reduce your ability to engage with the whole marketplace. It might not mean that you're going to be out of a job in no time at all, but if you choose not to change, you're probably going to be able to keep doing the same job. It's just that moving to different jobs might be more difficult. There are still stonemasons in the 21st century. People still build cathedrals and maintain cathedrals. But if you're going to be involved in architecture, you perhaps want to do a little bit more. The second entity that might need to adapt is the industry. Well, within the software testing industry, if it can be called that, there's an orthodoxy. If you've read your Thomas Kuhn, you'll recognise this orthodoxy by its signs. Those signs include bodies of knowledge, standards, best practices, qualifications. Every orthodoxy is challenged by a range of heterodoxies. Eventually, every orthodoxy is sidelined by a compelling alternative. So I'm not suggesting that the orthodox approach to testing is necessarily going to evolve, and I'm not suggesting there's going to be a whole-scale revolution in the approach to testing, but potentially that orthodoxy may become increasingly irrelevant to an increasing number of people. And as it does that, it may become obsolete and fade, no matter how good its processes or how definite its procedures. As we look into Agile teams, we find that an awful lot of testing is done by an awful lot of people who are not testers, who aren't engaged with the testing industry. So we've looked perhaps shortly at the way that testers have to change. We'll deal with that later. I've thrown away a few things about how the industry might adapt. We won't deal with that later. But teams, that's where the most fascinating parts of adaptation are. If you manage testers and need to supply your workforce of managed testers to an Agile project, you'll want your teams to adapt. But you'll also want to adapt your practices, your tools, and your strategies. And I think that this particular part of adaptation is really what we're all trying to do. That deserves our attention both in general, and that's what we're going to pay attention to in this webinar. Can we flip over a slide to conflict of strategy, sir? Thank you. So, there is a conflict. Now, I would usually say a conflict of values, but as I'm going to use value later on in this, I'm going to talk about a conflict of strategy. A strategy is a collection of values. There is a tension between some of the underlying ideas of agility and the underlying ideas of testing. That tension doesn't exist when you're looking at designing and coding, but it does exist when you look at testing within an Agile context. Now, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, some tensions are negative, some create a very positive energy. Some tensions allow extraordinary creativity. The tensions that exist, the differences in values that exist between Agile approaches and what testing needs are really kind of three different angles to the same thing you've got on your slides in front of you. In the first instance, agility is all about adapting. It's about changing what you do to fit the context. It's about learning through your processes. And I'm not saying that's not part of testing, but I am saying that testing takes a position of trying to predict the future. That's a difference in the makeup of these two processes. Agile approaches tend to concentrate on value, creating software that is valuable within the time that's available, as great as possible value within the smallest budget or time that you've got. That focus on value is relentless. It can cause some problems as the focus on value exposes certain risks that aren't necessarily considered. Testing, on the other hand, is very risk-focused. We're looking a lot at things that might go wrong, unexpected problems. Again, that can cause tension, but I'm sure you can see that there's a great deal of creative energy that can happen by taking those two tensions and taking those two values and putting them together and trying to back up the holes in one with the strengths of the other. Finally, and this is more personal perhaps, testing tends to be pessimistic. Agility tends to be optimistic. And that again can cause tensions, perhaps more in an interpersonal relationship way than in an overall technical way. So can we flip to the next slide, please, to adapting test strategy to Agile practice, the first one of those. Thank you. When we go to an Agile team and they're employing a bunch of lightweight methods, a bunch of Agile methods, there are lots of practices that Agile teams do. Many of those practices involve testing in some way. And one of the things that characterizes Agile projects is massive confirmatory testing. Huge numbers of tests of the order of thousands or tens of thousands running very frequently. 2-3 times a day, sometimes every hour, sometimes on every check-in. That particular Agile practice has, as you can imagine, a great effect on test strategy. That an awful lot of tests are being done so early on in the process. Tests are written at the same time as the code, sometimes a little bit before, sometimes a little bit after, but massive tests are written at the same time as the code to support and to give scaffolding to that code as it exists. That changes the way that testing works. An awful lot of testing that exists to show that value is retained, to show that something hasn't changed and broken, but so that something continues to work, that's all already being done. And again, in terms of test strategy, it's not necessarily being done by testers, it's being done by coders, by designers and by customers. In the literature and in the conferences and in the papers you read online and the blogs and the teams sometimes that one goes and joins with as a consultant in my position, it's fascinating to find that there is often little tester involvement. Beck's book, Extreme Testing Explained, famously went through 2 versions. The one without the blue line, the first version, had hardly any information about testing in it at all as regards a, if you like, professional tester. Lots of information about doing tests, not so much about being a tester. Further down the line, he's adapted it to introduce the skills of a professional tester. But often you'll go to a team and you'll find that if you're adapting to testing on an Agile team, you're that person. You're the person doing that adaptation because there isn't anybody else on the team who is a tester. 2 things that tend to go together on Agile teams that have an effect on on testing strategies are the very short timescales. Typically releases happen every few weeks and a product is valuable and to be released every couple of weeks. That changes the way that we work because we can't perhaps plan up front. We can't plan more than a few weeks in advance. Documentation is seen by some to be almost lacking on Agile projects. I would deeply disagree with that. The documentation is, however, different. One has to learn how to read it in terms of the unit tests, or how to appreciate it in terms of documentation is substituted for by interpersonal communication during meetings. One has to be more alert to these things and less keen to receive every possible piece of documentation on Agile projects. And finally, and this is mentioned in most of the books and happens on some of the teams, lots of roles are shared on Agile teams. On some Agile teams, I've come in and my access has been complete. I can read the code, I can change the code. If I find a bug, I'm expected not only to point out where it is in the code, but also potentially to go in and sort out the code if it's simple and easy to do. That's seen by some teams as a little dangerous, and in other teams I'm expected just to come in, look at the unit tests, do some testing, and potentially point out where a bug is in code. But I'm also expected to share my role. A lot of testing is done up front, a lot of testing is done with the code, a lot of customer involvement in testing turns into automated tests. So I'm expected to share my skills and my roles and help different aspects of the testing, not just do my own testing. So one has to adapt one's strategy to Agile practices. There are some general rules of thumb that I might use on this, and if we can flip to the next slide, please, Sue. When you are adapting what you do as a tester to Agile practices, I'd encourage two separate approaches. And the first is that as one focuses on value with these large-scale confirmatory tests, each one of which tells you that something continues to work in the way it is expected to work, as a tester we then have to focus on the other side. If every test says, yes, this expectation is met, or occasionally it doesn't quite do what we're expecting, that tells us a lot about value and whether value is there or is missing. What it doesn't tell us anything about is when the product itself does something that we're not expecting. As testers, we have to be adept at looking for surprises, at triggering them, at noticing when they happen, at judging them, and all of that is exploratory testing. Agile projects need exploratory testing to back up their large-scale automated testing in order to cover off that problem of risk. And it's a very powerful technique to use on Agile projects. The second thing is to be able to leverage the existing testing that's being done. I don't just mean in terms of looking at the testing that's being done, thinking, well, all that's been done, now I can get on with these things. This exploratory approach, that's perhaps half of the picture. The other half is to sit down with those tests, to be able to read through them and to look at them and say, well, perhaps we're missing a test here, or perhaps I can use my skills as a tester to refine the tests here. To get engaged with the existing tests, and maybe as a tester to put a few extra in, or to reuse some of the unit tests in your own exploratory testing or in your own risk-focused testing. One of the problems, though, that we miss, one of the things that we miss, one of the qualities that testing aims for is independence. We try to be independent of code so that we don't make too many assumptions about how it should work. We try not to get too drawn into the design. Typically on Agile projects, it's hard to maintain one's independence, or at least it's hard to maintain one's independence and still get value from all these other things that cut away at one's independence. My own approach is to try to use as much diversity as I can in terms of the eyes looking at the project and my understanding of the information coming from those people and from those diverse opinions. That gives me back some of the independence that I've lost. But undoubtedly, testers on Agile teams need to find a way to restore some of the value that's lost when independence is lost. So that's looking at adapting test strategy, teams, the way that teams deliver value. Let's briefly look at how one adapts tester skills. So I can flip to the next slide, please, Sue. As a tester on an Agile project, there's plenty of new skills to pick up. partly because your relationships change. You're sat close in with your designers, your coders, and your customer, and you have to demonstrate to each of those people that what you're doing is valuable and you have an appreciation of what they do. Clearly you can't do that without an appreciation of what they do. You have to sit down and understand what some of the coders are doing, what some of the designers are doing, why the customers have the issues they have or the values they have. We're generally quite good as testers at being customer advocates and working with customers. But perhaps more difficult is working with coders and designers, particularly if we haven't come from a technical background. Pairing with coders and designers can be both enormously educational and fascinating, and can help them appreciate how you can bring your skills to bear, although you may not be a terribly technical tester. Along with that, perhaps, is being able to read through unit tests. Many Agile projects use variant on JUnit, depending on what technology they're using. Being able to read those, to understand some of what they're doing, isn't a difficult proposition, and it does help you add great value to a team. Finally, as testers, we tend to sometimes be dropped out of a project when we're not needed. That's not going to happen on an Agile team. So all the way through to retrospectives, which happen fairly frequently, you have to be able to communicate your values, what you as a tester need, and to bring that into the team as something that is valuable to it. So as testers, we need to adapt our skills. As I say, sometimes that engenders an emotional reaction. And it may be that you as a tester, you don't want to adapt to these things. That's fine. But your ability to move within the industry may well be constrained by these things. Let's briefly look at some of the problems that can happen in an Agile team. Can I flip over the next slide? If I'm looking at common bugs on Agile projects, typically I'll find actually the code is rather better on an Agile project, and the design of the code really works together well. That's one of the effects of test-driven design. So where that's used on Agile projects, which isn't everywhere, you tend to find the code is really rather good, and it doesn't demonstrate the same number of bugs and the same density of rubbish bugs as many other coding approaches. However, there are clear weaknesses. Typically within Agile projects, very good testing is done around, if you like, the engine, the heart of a product has got really great testing because that's very controllable. However, those pieces that go off to interfaces, those are perhaps less robust, a bit more fragile. The user interface is obvious, but there are many examples in the literature, and I've got some that I'll deal with at the EuroSTAR presentation, of individual interfaces that have caused problems for Agile projects and that sometimes aren't recognized because one can't write a unit test to confirm the interface is reacting as expected. Secondly is the sense of confidence that comes from having massive confirmatory unit tests. If all the tests pass, then surely the product is working. Well, not if you've missed a test. Not if 2 or 3 things work well individually, but in combination, behaviours emerge between those. And those are common weaknesses on Agile projects. If one looks then, and we'll flip the slide again, at how Agile projects can go wrong, particularly when a tester is involved, I typically find those are around feedback and communication. The problems around these are to do with well, agility is a learning process. Agility is a process in which the teams learn about what they're building. As they learn about it, they build it better and they refine it. Feedback is vital to that. As a tester, you're giving great feedback. But problems can turn up. One sign that problems are going to turn up is if you arrive in an Agile team and say, can I have a look at your unit tests? And you're told, no, you can't. Those unit tests are for coders only. That's a clear sign of a problem that's maybe about to happen. Another problem that seems to be quite common is if testing happens after the end of an Agile cycle. If Agile projects operate in, let's say, 2-week cycles, it's not uncommon to see all the coding and design done in one 2-week cycle and given over to the testers for the next 2-week cycle. That, to me, is the sign of something that's very broken, because it's very hard to get feedback then into that coding and design process from testing. Testing becomes a silo. It doesn't become part of the Agile team, and ultimately that leads to testers being hugely pressurized and not terribly valuable. You need to get back into the cycle if you possibly can as a tester. Finally, more perhaps from our point of view as testers, it's possible to almost give a denial of service attack to the coding process if you find huge numbers of bugs. As an exploratory tester, I find it easy to find an awful lot of bugs. And it's a terrible thing to hold over an Agile project, the ability to find 10 or 15 bugs a day. And that can swamp a team very quickly. If each bug is taken as an individual item of work, an individual story, then teams can get slowed down by that an awful lot. There are lots of different coping strategies with that. I'm not saying that one should cope by finding fewer bugs, but by working with the coders in terms of the numbers of bugs you're finding. But it's a very straightforward way for a clumsy tester to come in and really break an Agile process. So that's really what I wanted to say. In conclusion, if I can flip to the second last slide, Agile projects are different from other testing projects. Testing is right at the heart of coding, and they're very adaptive rather than predictive. I've found Agile projects enormously fun, very exciting, and as a technologist, very satisfying. And I encourage those of you who are in the software testing industry to, if you want to, if you're in the situation where you can, to adapt to Agile teams when you need to adapt. And I think that you'll find that you'll thrive. That's the end of the talk. If I can flip over to one more slide, that is a list of people who have contributed to this talk, and I'd like to thank them individually very much. I won't read their names out. And if we can flip over to the last one, you'll see my contact details, and I think, Sue, we can go over to questions. I'm trying not to use words like infection. Let me start in a different approach. If one is independent, one isn't influenced by the prejudices of designing and coding, and you're already being diverse in some sense. If, however, you lose that independence, and you are part of the coding decisions, part of the designing decisions, you have lost your independence. So you need to bring back some diversity. And I think one does that by asking other people who aren't perhaps as involved in the coding and the development of an Agile system as you are as a tester to come in and work with the system while you watch them. I would typically use an observed beta test, or to farm the software out to individual people around the development organization who aren't directly involved in it, and try to observe them to see what I'm missing as a tester because I'm no longer independent. I hope that's okay for Mitch. Got another question? I don't think I ever said to ignore defects. There are many things one can do other than report them, but I think that as a tester, what one frequently does is log an awful lot of defects. Personally and professionally. You log them, you keep an eye on them, and you maybe go back to the coders and you say, these need to be fixed. Are they quick fixes or slow fixes? If they're quick fixes, well, perhaps they don't need to be tracked in the same way. They don't need to swamp the coders in the same way. You're still going to keep track of them, but they don't return to the feedback loop in the very major way that it would do if one raised a story for every defect. So I'm not suggesting that one ignores defects. I'm suggesting that some defects need to be treated differently from other defects. But in particular, what I'm suggesting is that one, as a tester, appreciates that by finding an awful lot of bugs very quickly, one is, on the surface, adding an awful lot of value to the project. But one is also heavily tripping the feedback process within an Agile team. And one needs to be very aware of that when logging an awful lot of bugs. And the problem there is to do with quantity rather than quality. I've got another question. I have big problems with finding really good stuff about Agile testing. Partly because some groups seem to think that Agile testing is all about writing confirmatory unit tests. Lisa Crispin's book famously says that all your tests should be automated. I'm not sure that that's, let me rephrase that. I don't think that's true. So I have problems looking for useful information. What I find is that information is turning up on blogs, interestingly, about incorporating testing into Agile approaches. I'd certainly suggest reading Elizabeth Hendrickson's blog from a point of view of somebody who's a test professional. I'd also recommend going to InfoQ and having looked through some of their parts that came from various conferences and various articles, because it seems to be a clearinghouse for people thinking about how to think about Agile and strategy. And once one has testing in with that, then InfoQ will give you lots of pointers. So the usual sources, SQE is one of those, the Betasoft forums, but I would also suggest have a look at InfoQ. So can you read that one again? I'm having trouble getting that all together in my head. So I'm assuming by entities then that we mean software entities. Right. I'm going to answer that thinking that we're talking about software entities rather than entities needing to be tested together in terms of individual teams. I'm assuming this is to do with the way that software is split up rather than disparate teams, so displaced teams. It can be difficult when you integrate. A lot of Agile development is focused on effectively components and building those components into larger systems. But it's not necessarily looking at combining minor systems, if you like, into major systems. For me, that's where test design really does have to kick in, and we have to start looking at end-to-end things. There is some approach to end-to-end testing that's turning up through user acceptance style testing. Automated acceptance testing is doing some end-to-end things, but particularly where, for instance, I've been involved with projects that have been agilely developing something that works on a handheld device, in a mobile cab, and then at a database back end. In those circumstances, there had to be quite a chunk of manual testing. I'd look to try to automate that where I could, but that's very much where emergent behaviours turn up, and I would give as many tools as I could to my best exploratory testers to test in that situation. The effects of the closeness of system testing to code. Firstly, I think system testing is generally rather badly defined, and if we were able to exchange conversations, I'd love to know exactly what the questioner means by system test. Not that I would necessarily disagree or agree, but it would help me frame the question. If we look at system testing as the testing of the overall system, it's important to recognise that those massive confirmatory tests in Agile approaches tend to be quite close to the code. Some are further away, some are broader user acceptance testing, some look at end-to-end testing, but I'd come back to the answer for the previous question. Where you're looking at system testing, you're typically looking at emergent behaviours. You can write a lot of confirmatory tests around system testing just to make sure that data flows from one end to the other, but I would be looking for emergent behaviours and properties that are unexpected of the system. Feeding that back into an Agile process in the Agile timescales is very hard, and that's why I'd say to give, as really good exploratory testers, really great tools to spot those emergent problems. Yeah, thank you very much. If you search for the name Scott Ambler, Ambler, and his link is ambisoft, ambysoft.com, you'll find all the stuff you need. It's important to note that Scott has made his results entirely open, sorry, not his results, his data completely open. He's made his data available to the community. So you can see precisely what the survey answers were. You can draw your own conclusions and do your own analysis of it. I found that to be illuminating. Do I have it? Well, this is the problem. Of course, I'm a consultant, so I've worked in lots of different regimes, Agile and not. Yes, I have seen an iteration that solely looks to deliver something into production that is to do with putting lots of things together. One of the previous questioners asked a question that I think was about how to bring disparate components together into an overall system. I have seen that process. It tends to be closer to what gets called a bug fix iteration. I'm not sure that the designers and coders were terribly pleased about doing it. They didn't feel like they were moving forwards. But yes, I have seen iterations that bring things into production and that do something that those of you who make interactive things might call snagging, where you wander around and you look for all the snags that could happen and try to fix them. I prefer to see a lot of that done up front as early as possible, of course. But yes, for some projects it seems to be a viable way forward. I'm not sure that it would be in every project. I think that's a really hard one. When you've got testers in a pool, then they're not involved with the Agile project. They're just turning up to do some testing and pushing off again. It's very hard for them to be part of an Agile team. I would personally try to get some testers attached to a project. Don't forget that a tester on an Agile project has a shared role. They're already doing a chunk of the things that other people are doing. They're contributing to the design, they're talking about the code, they're doing some paired work. Somebody from a pool may not be able to do that. They may simply show up, find an awful lot of bugs, cause that problem with the feedback that we've seen, and then back out of the project. For me, that's often quite poisonous. I haven't seen a good way to test on an Agile project with testers pooled away from that Agile project. I have seen good ways of working with testers, if you like, pooled within the Agile project and dispersed to testing and maybe non-testing jobs as the day goes on and as the weeks go on. But to pool testers away from an Agile project in a group and then bring them in only from time to time, I think you're looking at the point at which an Agile approach drops into, well, we've finished this bit of Agile, now let's go back into the existing waterfall process. Whether you can make that work or not, well, that's perhaps up to your organisation. I would say a sense of engagement with what's being built. And is that it? Lovely. Okay. Thank you all very much for listening to this webinar. If you've got any comments, please email them to me or to Sue. Thank you very much.